Hey y'all, I'm the captain and this is Sailing on the Spectrum, where I talk about the challenges growing up with autism spectrum disorder. Welcome aboard. Today I want to talk about the issue of being assertive if you're on the spectrum. It's an issue with most anybody to know a good and healthy way to be assertive and to basically stand up for yourself and know that when you're being taken advantage of, know how to deal and confront somebody, and that is something anybody should be able to, uh, or try to be able to do in a healthy way. Now, I'll tell you, that's one thing that people on the spectrum have very hard time doing, and certainly have a hard time doing it as naturally and as easily as others. When you're on the spectrum, there are certain wirings in your brain that are different than others who we would say are neurotypical, who are not on the autism spectrum. Uh, they People like myself, we really are born with a certain, I guess you would say, I would call it glitch, but that's probably not a good term, because there are aspects to us on the spectrum that are actually can be used as strengths. But as far as being, assertive and such in those type situations, the part of our brain that is wired differently causes us to not be able to do that as easily when we need to. And it's like that fight or flight response. Usually that comes into play in a lot more of a raw and uh, uh, I don't know, more of a rapid way than most others. For most other people, obviously everybody has a certain fight or flight response and certain things that can trigger it, but for us on the spectrum, obviously a lot of sensory sensitivities can cause that to happen for us. And it's important for us to know how to manage that and to know uh, what's the best way to respond. But especially when we're kids, when we're younger, we can be especially vulnerable to those types of triggers. And certainly some of those triggers can happen with people who you need to confront, whether they be a bully, that's a big one, or maybe even an authority figure who may be abusive, and I'm not necessarily talking about physically abusive, although it could certainly be that. And that's sad, that there are those who abuse children that way, whether they be physical or sexual or other ways, verbal. There's just certain things that can, make people, those types of people who can invoke those triggers in people, but especially those on the spectrum. And you're a kid, it could be a teacher, it could be even a parent. Uh, it could be some other adult, somebody else in whose charge you've been put. And it's heartbreaking to think about those who are taken advantage of if they're kids, but certainly if they're kids on the spectrum, and not only if they're kids on the spectrum, but adults. Because people on the spectrum, you see, don't know easily how to communicate what they need to as naturally as others, and especially in tense situations where it calls for somebody to be able to emote their feelings and do it in a good way, and in a way that it's done at the time it needs to, things that need to be said when they need to be said. That's not something I was ever able to really do. And it's, I think, good in some ways to not have as your instinct to be aggressive. Obviously, there are far too many who can too easily be aggressive when they shouldn't be. That can be their general mode. They can be lit like that, and that's terrible to, have that in you and to let that be something that you just let run amok, in your person. Uh, but what do you do when it's the other people who are doing that to you? Uh, it's easy for us to sometimes be the opposite. There's two extremes where you're either aggressive, and overly, and you're just constantly lashing out, either physically or otherwise, or you're being passive, which means you're just apologizing, and maybe passive, and maybe you're just out and out apologetic and guilty and fear based. I think that those are things I'd say generally. I would say, I'm tempted to say that I don't know the statistics, but I think people on the spectrum would be more inclined to be more on the apologetic side, passive side. That doesn't mean, people on the spectrum aren't aggressive sometimes overly when, it wouldn't be wise to be. It's just that so many of us don't know what else to do. And it's important that we have people in our life and we have examples in our life and people who help empower us, to help us know that we're worthy, that it's important for us to know that we have sufficient worth in our own person to know that we can be stood up for, to stand up for ourselves. And it's important, no matter who you are, to have people in your life who can stand up for you, who back you up. And it doesn't mean that they have to back you up right when you're dealing with someone. You just have to know that there are people in your life who love you and have your back and view you as worthy, and say you're worth it, that you're somebody important to them. And I'm happy I have people in my life like that. I have a wife and little girl who do, but I also have other friends too, and those are very important people to me. And those were not things that I had very good reserves of growing up. I had a mom and dad who loved me, and I had a sister who I got along with. It was just hard, I guess, sometimes, because I guess growing up, it seemed like any authority figure I was taught to feel was always going to know, just basically as a matter of default, always going to know what was best. And that no matter what they said to me or how they treated me, I had to basically, yield to that, whoever that was, and that anything that was an issue with me, and especially if anything I had growing up that was an issue with me being on the autism spectrum, if they had a problem with it, that meant that I was a problem to them and that I was a problem, period. I don't think that my parents ever meant to teach me that. I think it was just something that was easily a communicated thing that came through because of the environment I grew up in. I had and I could go into all that even more, but basically, I know that once I was in high school, I got into situations where I'd start to, be in a job. I remember the first job I have probably in the middle of high school. Well, it was during the summer, and one of the guys who was kind of the in-charge guy, it wasn't the main guy I answered to, but he was in charge of a bunch of us guys doing something, and I was just slow because I was new and I didn't really know what I was doing, but he just exploded on me one day, and I just didn't know how to take it. I kind of, just was very silent about it, and I might have said something to my mom about it later, but I, didn't even know the other people for whom I worked. I guess the real bosses, I couldn't really say anything to them, and I was afraid to, because I thought I would just be told that I was just being unsubmissive, and stuff like that. And that kind of was sadly was something I carried with me in other places I would work. It was not, I remember working in different places and just going through that, and I was afraid, honestly, to look for other jobs. Maybe because I was afraid I would be in a situation where I'd be stuck like that and I couldn't stand up for myself, and I would be made to feel like that if I can't just deal with somebody or a boss or an environment that's just, too much, or that is not treating me, where I just feel very, where I just don't feel like I'm being respected very much, and by that I mean not, I'm just being mistreated or being spoken rudely, that I'd have no way of standing up for myself, because I would just be told I'm just insubordinate, and not, and that I should just, get kicked out the door. And it's sad because I could be in situations where I wouldn't be working in a place where I'd be working worth what I ought to be worth. I'd be paying, I'd just be in situations where I'd just be dirt poor and not being, and feeling like I just was on eggshells all the time whenever I was at work. And I was a very good worker, but for a long time I worked at this place at the dining room at my old college. I guess maybe because I was in such a familiar environment, I didn't feel as in on pins and needles around everybody, because I knew a lot of people. Sure enough, about 3 years ago or so, 3.5 years ago, my boss, who I'd had for a while, and the company I'd been with for a while working there, got moved on. Another company won out, and the new people, I ended up wanting to stay and work for them just because I would be in the same environment. But as it turns out, sure enough, there were a lot of red flags, and as the months wore on, I knew I wasn't going to be staying there very long. And keep in mind, by then, I was an adult, I'd been married, and I had a little girl. I knew a lot of things about myself that I didn't know before. And I had a lot of reason to be confident, even though I still, struggled, and even do now, with a lot of self-confidence. But I remember when push came to shove, I finally said, you know what, I've had it with you guys, I'm out of here. I even remember telling one of the bosses, who was a particularly difficult person, just basically, look, the problem isn't us, the problem is you. You can deal with it. And I just told him that. And he just got upset and yelled in my face in front of a couple of other guys, and then just stalked off to one of the other big bosses, and basically nothing came of it. But when I talked to one of the other big bosses about it later, this guy basically just took his side, and I said, well, you know what, I don't see if this going anywhere good, so maybe it's best that I just give you my 2 weeks and say bye, guys. And I don't know, I just basically had to, in that moment, say I'm not under obligation to bend over backwards to please somebody who is just whose ideas and attitudes are just so out of whack. And I had to be confident that wherever I would go next, I could know that I could look for something where I could know that the people on the other side could see that I was worth what I was worth. And lo and behold, I've been with people working for about 2.5 years now, almost 3 years, and it's been as good a situation as could possibly be. Who knows what the future may hold, but all I know is right now I'm in as good a situation as I have ever been. And thankfully, a lot of it happened because of the fact that I was assertive enough to not be stuck in a situation where I was going to be taken advantage of and made to work harder, and only to get pushed around and treated like garbage. And it would help. A lot of it helped because I knew that the people around me were miserable too, where I had been last, when this new company had taken over. And and I was able to just see, I was finally able to see that, hey, once I'm able to stand up for myself enough, when I see, I can know, it doesn't matter if I grew up on the spectrum and I had issues, with social interaction and stuff, I still have a right, and I still have clout to be able to see for myself what I'm worth, and to be able to know when I can say the other person isn't treating me like I ought to be treated. I'm in situations now where, I sometimes might, stumble upon customers who are like that to me. I'm not aggressive with them, but in those moments, I'm able to say, all right, look, I talk as reasonably as I can, and if, they're being threatening or something like that, I just say, all right, bye. And I have bosses who know me enough to understand that, to hear my side and to not assume the worst about me and threaten me and make me feel like they got to twist my arm and make me worry and be on pins and needles all the time. And knowing that, I have confidence, and that's a good place to be. That's not a place that many people on the spectrum can be. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments section. Feel free to leave whatever you need in the comments section, and if you have any questions about how you can get out of situations or deal with situations where maybe you're being taken advantage of, if you're on the spectrum or not. When, hey, I'm on the spectrum, and thankfully I've gotten to the place where I am now, so I don't know, hopefully there's something I can impart to you that would be helpful. But as always, thank you for joining me on this voyage, and I'll see you when we set out again. This is the captain signing off. See you next time.